Hello and welcome to the August edition of the Farmer Supply Association Ag Ride Report. I'm Randy Klepechka, agronomist with Farmer Supply Association. We're taping on August the 2nd. August is always a great month. That's the month that harvest starts and football season starts, so life is good right now as we get into August. We're continuing on the fast track with our crop, and I've been talking about that most of the year. We had a little break last week, the week of July 22nd. It rained, it just showered every day. It didn't really rain that much. We were watering beans like crazy this week because we didn't get a lot of rain, but we had cooler days in the 80s, some showers and everything that kind of slowed that fast track down. But this week we're right back on it with highs in the 90s every day, sunshine, and the crop's really back on track, and things are happening fast. Looking statewide in Arkansas, the harvest has begun this week. Actually, we got it started in July. I know a lot of people was kind of thinking, maybe we can get this thing started in July, and we've cut stuff in July before. It's not anything brand new, but it is kind of interesting to get started that early. There was some rice cut, I know, up in the Walnut Ridge, Paragould area up there. They've cut some rice. Down in my home area around Hazen, they've cut soybeans already down there. So we're really getting going fast, and things are happening by the day. On this program, I really want to talk about some considerations as we near harvest, some things we need to be finishing up on. We're not totally finished with this crop yet. There's still some things that our farmers have to keep in mind. So I want to talk about some of those things on this program this week. First, we're going to talk about insects. And first thing I want to talk about is rice stink bugs. And for the most part, it's been a very low, I guess you could say a low to moderate year as far as stink bug numbers. Hadn't been much spraying going on at all. I was at the field day at Stuttgart on August 1st. They said maybe 30 to 40% of the crop will end up being sprayed this year, but really it's been low numbers. Now, there have been exceptions. I really hadn't seen much sprayed at all until this week, and I ran into one farm in particular that had some pretty high levels of immature stink bugs. Once those things turn tan, they're feeding on the rice grain, so things can happen pretty quickly, even though they're not adults yet. So that's what I was seeing a couple of days ago on one farm, some pretty high numbers, and they're spraying some of that crop probably within the next day or so. So again, just because we've been seeing low numbers and none in places doesn't mean you can let your guard down, because they can still be a problem. And I think as we get into some of this really late rice that's just now heading, or maybe hasn't even headed yet, that all these, these stink bugs from these riper fields are going to congregate on that late rice. So you really need to watch the late rice that hasn't headed or is just now heading, because we could have some really high numbers there. So don't let your guard down is the bottom line. The treatment level is 10 per 10 sweeps, so remember that. The really go-to insecticide this year is Tenchu. Tenchu's been around a while, but nobody's really ever used it because they've had such a low amount of supply available. But they've got the supply available right now, so really it's the go-to material. So 8 ounces of Tenchu, I think, is going to be your best option. The university says that maybe there might be a fit in some places for Lambda, the generic pyrethroid that's a lot more economical than Tenchu and some of the other things. But again, it's got to work. Regardless of what the price is, it's not economical if it doesn't work. So we really need to keep Tenchu in the front. Now they do say, and I don't totally agree with them, that once you get late in the season, it's near termination of insecticide time, and you've got some just barely above treatment level, that maybe you can go to something like Lambda and get that number knocked down below treatment level. But some of the stuff I've seen with Lambda since about 2019, the results have just not been good. Haven't killed or controlled very many stink bugs at all. So be careful on using Lambda and thinking you're going to get much out of it, because you might get enough just to knock you below threshold if you have those moderate numbers. But don't hold your breath on it. I'm much more confident in using Tenchu. Again, termination is when 60% of the heads are straw colored. We're about there on this field here. We're getting about to that point where we're that far along. And again, keep that late rice in mind. So that's rice stink bugs. Turning into soybeans, again, a very low insect year for the most part with stink bugs. Corn earworm numbers have been very low. I found some fields where I might get 3 or 4 per 25 sweeps. The treatment level is right around 9-ish, somewhere. It's economic sliding threshold, so it's not exact, but somewhere around 9 or so is our threshold. and I've barely got half threshold anywhere I've looked. So again, those numbers are very low. The moth trap catches are about as low as I've ever seen since I've been keeping up with that. So we're probably not going to have a problem with corn earworm and beans, but again, watch those late beans just in case we do have a moth flight and get some numbers there. Now, armyworms has been a little bit of another story. We have had some armyworm issues, especially in our late crops, our late soybeans, our late rice, and we go on defoliation on that with soybeans, 25% defoliation after bloom, so keep that in mind. On rice, which is a little more unique thing, but I've had some rice fields that are some real late rice that I recommended treatment on, and it may have been just a tad below treatment level, but they were flying across it with a herbicide anyway, so that allows you to maybe knock that treatment threshold down a little bit. So I've recommended a little bit of Intrepid on armyworms in rice. So again, if you got some really late rice just now heading or hasn't headed yet, keep your eyes on that. Treatment is, again, 20% defoliation in that green ring to heading period. And then after heading, you need to see head cutting. If you see head cutting, obviously you've got some damage, so you can think about spraying there. So that's the insect situation. Again, pretty low this year for the most part, but don't let your guard down until it's time to do that. I want to talk about irrigation termination. That's another thing we got to keep in mind on rice. Kind of some general things to keep in mind on rice with irrigation termination. About 25 days after 50% heading is kind of a general rule of thumb. That's what your DD50 actually shows, is 25 days after 50% heading. A visual thing we can look at is 2/3 of the panicle straw colored, at least on the silt loam and lighter soils. And then on the very heavy clay soils, 1/3 of the panicle is straw colored. If you're at that point, then that's a visual thing you can look at and go by. Those are good general things, but as far as making a definite decision, I think we need to keep some other considerations in mind and make it more real world. One is soil type, and the field I'm in right now, this is some fairly light soil, and every time the farmer wants me to make recommendations on this field or this farm in general, I'll always ask, well, how long is that water going to sit there after we shut the well off? And they'll always say it just goes right through the ground. So in those cases, you've got to stay a little bit longer than on that heavier soil. If it's a real heavy soil, I was looking at some rice over around Parkin earlier this week for another problem, and that guy had already drained some rice that basically was right at heading. I mean, that ground is going to stay wet, and it'll probably be too wet at harvest, even if you draining it that early. So keep that soil type in mind. How long will it hold water? How long is it going to stay wet? You got to keep that weather forecast in mind, and this year we're looking at very dry weather forecast, hot weather, so that ground's going to dry out quicker than it would otherwise. Like the weather last week when it was showery every day and a little cooler, it's going to take longer to dry out. But right now with this low humidity, these hot temperatures, sunshine, it's going to dry out quick, so we've really got to, be conservative on that and don't try to drain too early. I mean, just make sure that ground's going to have good moisture until harvest, in situations like this. Another thing we've got to consider, and that's something we don't talk about that much, is when are you going to cut the rice or when are you going to harvest? It may meet all those criteria I just talked about, but if you've got 2,000, 3,000 acres of rice and it's going to be a month before you get to it, then that ground could get over dry and you could have lodging and things like that. So keep that in mind, and if it's ground that it's probably going to be a month or so, or could be before you harvest it, well, let's be a little cautious on that and don't go too early, because I don't like that ground to dry out too quick. The stalks get weak and they can fall over, and it's not a pretty situation. I've seen that happen a few times, and it's not good when you do that. So keep when you're going to cut the field, keep that in mind as well. Soybeans irrigation termination, we need to look at growth stage 6.5. You're going to see some color at that point. And if you open that pod up, those seeds will separate from that pod wall. They're kind of loose in there. And once you get to that point, you're pretty much done with weight gain of the seed. So, at that point, especially if I'd like to have good moisture at that point, but you should be done at that point as far as any additional irrigations. One other thing that some farmers will use, not all farmers, and sometimes I think it's overdone, and it really needs to be done properly if you're going to do it, and that's the use of harvest aids. With rice and sodium chlorate, we like to see that moisture kind of in between that 18 to 23 range when we apply for a harvest aid out there. And the big key is don't let it sit in the field too long. We need to get it really harvested in 5 or 6 days at the most, because if you let it over dry, we can really have some milling issues. So again, 18 to 23 if you're going to do it. Harvest within 5 days if at all possible, and certainly very little more than that, but try to keep it in that range right there. Soybeans, harvest stage on soybeans, we want those beans to be at growth stage R7, and at that point we've got one mature pod on the plant that's got that mature brown pod color. If you got that, and you're probably at a good point right there. We also want, again, the separation like I talked about a while ago, the separation of the soybean from that pod wall. And another thing we want is starting to see some leaf drop there. So at that point, you can put the harvest date out for soybeans. I used to always go with that R6.5 recommendation. That's what Louisiana does. But Arkansas has got some data that you're still losing yield a little bit, even at that R6.5 point. So go to R7, and before R6.5, you can lose a lot of yield. So don't even think about that. If you've got John Deere green pods out there, you need to be waiting before you apply that harvest date. So again, harvest is near, and can't wait till next month on our September program. I'm sure we'll be talking about yields, and hopefully we've got some good news right there. So until next time, this has been Randy Klepeczka with your Farmer Supply Association Agri Report.